to the degree that you want something is the degree you're afraid of not having.
Yeah.
God, I wish I started when I was younger. I go, well, yeah, but you didn't. So shut the fuck up and let's
Right.
keep going.
Right.
Like, you can't.
Nobody changes until they change their energy. And when you change your energy, you change your life. Because it's not till then that it's really real.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, this is way worse than I thought. It's like, oh yeah, it's way, way worse than you thought.
Yeah.
But luckily, there's more to you than you think.
Dr. Ross Ellenhorn, welcome.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you. I really, really enjoyed reading your book, and I'm tempted to turn this into an entire 10-hour Audible that just covers every single thing in your book. But I wanted to start with something that my stepmom once told me. She said, don't even bother trying to change somebody else, because think about how hard it is to make a change yourself. And I was like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Like, what chance do I ever have in changing anybody else when it is absolutely so blisteringly hard, takes absolutely everything that I got to make a change in my own life? And I think I have the hubris to think that I'm going to change somebody else. Get out of here. And that was really, really good advice. And this book really highlights how difficult it is and the resistance we face in making a change ourselves.
Yeah. I mean, part of it's based on really what we learn as psychotherapists, right? Which is that we're really not there to force the person to change, but to create the right kind of mental space for them to make decisions about change. It's that classic light bulb joke, right? We're not, it has to want to change. And it's trying to kind of bring back that ethos in a world where there's just so many publications telling people kind of how to change. And in my mind, that kind of thinking can become kind of shameful, because a person tries it, they follow the instructions, and then they're let down over and over again. And it also doesn't approach change as how I understand change happens, which it happens from a place of contemplation, from a place where you're kind of weighing the pros and cons of why you're changing, not saying I have to change or I should change.
That's a really interesting concept that makes a ton of sense, of course, and I want to dive into that first. But yeah, as you said, I mean, we get all of this projected on us saying, oh, do or do not, there is no try. I mean, Yoda said that, right? And we're like, oh, okay, yeah, like we don't try to change, we just change, we just do it. It's binary, it's yes or no. And while that's aspirational, and in some ways, perhaps that aspiration is helpful, it also can have some of those negative consequences. So when you're approaching this the right way, you say it always starts with contemplation. So explain what that type of contemplation is and how to productively contemplate before you embark on any change.
Yeah, so this kind of contemplation I'm talking about is really kind of the classic idea of weighing pros and cons, on one hand, on the other. And we know this really well from the addiction world, that the old models that used to say sort of, you got to knock this person over the head with the fact that they have an addiction, that their brain is hijacked, and if they've been knocked over the head enough, you'll force them to see that they have a problem, actually doesn't work. AA's got this like 8% success rate. Most substance abuse programs have miserable success rates. And then there's this way of looking at things. This comes from this idea called motivational interviewing, which is really saying, well, aren't there like good sides that a person wants from their use? And shouldn't we talk about what they might want from their use before we talk about just getting rid of it? Right. And what would happen if we took a non-judgmental approach to that? That yes, it makes sense that you want to be with your friends at the bar. Yes, it makes sense that that'll be a big change in your life. You leave that. Yes, it makes sense that you're trying to kind of medicate your trauma, and that this is the best way you found, and that giving it up gives that up. That from that place, a person might make a decision that they want to change, but they're not going to make the decision if it's all just about the change is the logical right thing to do, and there's no other choice but to change.
That's it's something that Gabor Mate says, and I know he's got a quote on the cover of your book. He says, all addiction is an attempt to solve a problem. So in this contemplation, you got to figure out what is the problem that you're trying to solve with the behavior that you're engaging in, whether that's overeating or whether that's addiction or whether that's procrastination. Like, what are you trying to solve? And I think that's an incredibly productive way to look at it, rather than, the shame that comes from, well, I should be, just
Right.
shooting on yourself constantly. And then that's going to lead to this downward spiral of your own, confidence in yourself, your own faith in yourself, as you talk about.
That's right. And it also means that if you don't do the thing that supposedly is the good thing, you can take a less judgmental view of yourself at that point. Okay, so I didn't do the diet tonight. Well, that's because there's all these things that are attractive about not doing it. And I can have some affection for myself about that. That's going to make it so the diet's more possible than if you say, I blew it on the diet tonight.
Yeah.
Right? No, I made the decision in the other direction tonight because I just did. That's, I'm fallible, and I did it for these and by the way, I did it for these sort of self-loving reasons. It tastes really good to put a lot of fat in your mouth,
Yeah.
especially when there's a lot of fat and there's some sugar in that fat. That's really great,
Yeah.
So it's also trying to not be judgmental at those points when you supposedly fail at this, right? And that enters a world where you can actually make better decisions.
You say, when you're talking about contemplation, self-acceptance is a prerequisite for change, largely because it is the prerequisite for contemplation. And that's a little bit what you're talking about. But explain how self-acceptance is the prerequisite for both change and contemplation.
Yeah, this is not my thinking. This is just the basics of what people talk about when they talk about the dynamic of change, which is that to change, you have to be accepting of yourself. And to change, you have to see that there's some part of you that you don't accept. And that dynamic is this paradox you're always in at the point of change. It's a both and, it's not an either or situation. And you have to be able to hold that both and experience, that I'm fully accepting of myself, but there's also a part of me I don't want anymore. And so all change requires that conversation, that kind of dialogue between accepting and not accepting in a place where you're kind of accepting of yourself, if that makes sense.
When, and I've seen this in myself and other people, when there's a strong sense of self-judgment and a strong sense of shame, it'll actually mask the truth about what's actually happening. You'll be in denial of actually what you're expressing, what you're doing. If you're drinking a bunch and you're actually an alcoholic, you'll be in denial of your alcoholism, because you're ashamed of that thing. So part of the self-acceptance just allows you to have the awareness to look at actually what you're doing. Like, oh, I'm doing this and it's okay. Because if it's not okay, you'll trick yourself. You'll trick yourself all day and pretend that you're not doing that thing to avoid the judgment that's going to come from yourself and the shame that's going to come from yourself, which is a horrible feeling to have. So you'll come up with all these rationalizations and justifications. So without that self-acceptance, you're not even going to be able to look at what you're actually doing, it seems.
Right, exactly. So that means that change requires that we get to that place of self-acceptance. It does not require that we tell people how to change, right? That's much more important to, we're not surgeons, we're farmers, we're trying to create the right soil. We're not trying to intervene. My field has this horrible term, intervention. It's just a horrible term. Intervention, the term intervention means to come in on something passive and remove something from it. Right? And that's exactly not what works with human beings. It works with human beings when there's a cancer, but it doesn't work on human behavior. It doesn't work on a person's soul. That requires that you're trying to create a fertile ground for them to make the right choice.
Right.
And the right choice they make is towards growth. When they're in a position where they can make that choice, is towards growth.
Yeah. And just to highlight how difficult this is to change for people who are kind of unaware. I mean, most people probably know, but you list some facts. You say we spend $30 billion getting in shape. 73% of us don't reach fitness goals. Weight loss is 66 billion, 69% quit diets. 8 out of 10 people who actually go on their diets gain their weight back. And 93% of people making New Year's resolutions break them. I mean, so basically what we're saying here is either A, it's really hard, which is true probably. It's both and. It's really hard, and we're going about this whole process of change in probably flawed ways because those statistics are pretty poor.
Yeah, and that I think I talk about know your enemy. I mean, why are we writing all these books about how to change instead of saying, well, but this other thing's more powerful. Sameness is more powerful. It's more sophisticated. It's got a hold of us. So why aren't we looking at sameness instead of change? Because if we can figure out sameness and kind of understand it, we might be in a better place to change. And so the book is really about all the forces that make us the same, the original title was, it was sort of making fun of self-help books. It was the 10 reasons not to change. Right? And that just wouldn't sell. Who's going to buy that? But that's the idea. Like, this is like, there are real reasons,
Yeah, and I think that's such a good way to frame it. Resistance to change is a desire for sameness. And you're asking the question, why do we want sameness?
Right.
And that's a really interesting way to look at it, because everybody focuses on the resistance. I have resistance to change. Okay, yes, but what is that? That's you desiring to stay exactly the same. And
right,
why?
Exactly. So it's not really resistance, it's you're moving towards sameness.
Right. which makes a lot more sense, actually.
Yeah.
So talk about, to get into this, we got to talk about hope and then our fear of hope.
Mm-hmm. So I've been doing this research on fear of hope, and it comes out of my own experiences, and I could tell you a little bit about that, and then my experiences working with people who have had significant experiences being treated for psychiatric issues. Is that okay if I go through?
But yes, absolutely. But first, let's just define hope for people before we get into the fear of hope. So how would you define hope?
Hope is not quite an emotion. It's an emotion and it's a posture. Okay, so like paranoia is not just an emotion. It's an emotion and a posture. It's a position towards the world, right? So it's a posture that is sort of a loving orientation towards something you want to achieve that you don't know if you can get. So hope is a feeling you have in the midst of uncertainty. There is no hope when things are certain. It just doesn't happen. You don't feel hopeful. Hope arises when you don't know if you can get the thing. Optimism is this cheap emotion that is like, well, I'll just get it. I'm going to have that thing. Right? Hope is this yearning for a thing you don't know if you'll get. So hope and uncertainty go together. It's the feeling you have in points of uncertainty.
Yeah.
And it drives you. It's a driving emotion. It drives you to that thing. Hope, whenever you hope, you appoint something as more important than before you hoped for it. So it's Christmas and your parents ask you what you want. You don't know what you want. And then you say bike. And the minute you say bike, all of a sudden bike becomes the one thing you have to have in life. That's because you're hoping at that point. And then you recognize you don't have a bike. So hope always points out what you don't have in your life too. And that's why it's a risk. Because if you don't get the thing that you hope for, you're in a state of recognizing you didn't get something you made important and you lack in your life. And so it's a scary emotion because it drives us to these feelings of disappointment. I didn't get that thing that would make my life better. That's a horrible feeling. And so we develop these fears of hope. Does that make sense, Way?
It makes absolute sense.
Yeah.
So then that's that fear of hope, which is something that even that turn of phrase and is something that for a lot of people, like fearing hope, like what do you even mean? Hope is supposed to be a good thing, but really like unpacking how scary it is to, one, get out of the denial that there could be something about your life that would be better than your life currently is.
Yeah.
And then placing that hope and expectation are also kind of very, very closely linked. That hope then becomes an expectation, which then sets you up for massive disappointments. And you talk a lot about that in the book as well. But it puts you in tension. The minute you start hoping, it puts you in this kind of existential tension.
That's right. And, you're right that people are sort of surprised when I talk about fear of hope, but you can't read any theologians that say, hey, go ahead and hope. It's a great thing. They say, this is going to take a lot of prayer and a lot of courage for you to hope. This takes work. Martin Luther King spent his entire career trying to cajole people into hoping because it's not an easy thing, and great leaders are always about how do I get people to hope, because it's not an easy, simple thing. You can't just make it happen in your head. The tension, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Oh, the tension you're talking about is that when you hope, especially when it's something about yourself, you're putting this other religious term in front of you, which is, do you have enough faith in yourself to get to that thing you want? And you have enough faith in yourself that if you don't get that thing, you can handle it. And so that is a tension at that point when you go to something you want in your own life, is, do I believe in myself enough, and can I generate enough hope to get there? So it puts you in an existential bind. I am in charge here. I'm driving the bus. That's an existential moment. I'm driving this bus. And at the end, I may discover I'm not very good at this.
Now we're getting into the meat of some really interesting things, because that tension that comes from hoping for something, right? The sovereignty and the responsibility that you're taking on when you realize that there's hope, and you have this kind of idea that you could participate in that thing, in that change that you want to bring about, that puts that responsibility on yourself, which then opens you up to this whole cavalcade of judgment again if you fail. Right. And that's where the faith in yourself, is really, really pretty crucial at that point. And you talk a lot about that. I thought the most powerful thing that you talked about was, if you have hope, if you have like hope for something, but without faith in yourself, and there's an obstacle in your way, something is blocking you, but you don't have faith, you'll immediately discard it. You'll be like,
right.
This isn't the way. But if you have a little bit more faith, you'll find all of the other ways that you can go around, through, underneath, obliterate that obstacle and make it to your goal. So It's like, this other thing that we can really recognize is that, hope and faith, it's important to just understand how these two things interplay.
Yeah. Matter of fact, the stuff we're really interested in our research is not people that are hopeless and have fear of hope. It's about people that score high in hope and have fear of hope. All kinds of crazy shit happens for those people, because they're actually people that want stuff in life. They haven't given up, but they're terrified in the same way you described about their faith in themselves, because they've been so hurt by disappointment. So they're not hopeless people. It's just that they're so worried about if they follow hope. Hope becomes this dangerous thing to them. Like, it'll follow me into disappointment again. And it's when those combinations happen that all kinds of stuff happens. Anxiety goes up. People get into these counterfactuals. I should have done that. I should have done this. So they do these should haves all the time. And that happens in people, especially who have those two things going on at the same time, high hope and high fear of hope. So what's going on for them? Well, in our mind, it's the faith issue, right? That they don't think they can make it through that, so they're scared of it. A person with high hope and high fear of hope will not recognize a good event coming up as quickly as a person who's hopeless. Person who's hopeless is like, yeah, big deal, good event coming up. Person who's high hope is like, oh no, I'm going to get excited and then I'll be let down, right?
Right. So the hopeless person is almost dampening the entire realm of possibilities.
Right.
They're just saying that nothing that happens even matters. So I'm not even going to hope, because my life sucks so bad that nothing that happens matters anyways. So if this happens, yeah, sure. That's going to be the moderately better or some modicum of improvement, but it doesn't matter. And so it kind of dampens this whole world. It's almost an escapism from the tension of hope, is to be hopeless. It's just to say, look, nothing matters. It's like, I don't even care. And then that just like removes them from the game, and that anxiety of actually having to hope for something, recognizing that something could be better than it already is.
That's right. That's exactly right. Right. So I show these videos of these people on a high dive board, either jumping or chickening out. They're great videos, because they show this metaphor for what it's like to be that high up and be afraid of heights, because that's what high hope and high fear of hope look like. I don't show the people that never go up on the board. Right. And those are the hopeless ones. These are people that went up the board. They actually wanted to do it. Now they're scared up there,
Right.
So it's like, hope and courage are combined. They're connected,
What's the thing that you recommend people work to cultivate? If you want to cultivate more courage, if you want to cultivate more faith, what is the practice? How do we get into cultivating that greater sense of faith in ourselves, that greater sense of courage in the face of these things? And those might be two different questions.
I'm going to be a little disappointing to you during this talk because I don't give advice. I just don't quite believe in it.
Just like I said from the start, you're just creating the soil. You're just adding fertilizer to the soil right now. Don't worry.
I actually think that there's this social psychological term called self-efficacy, which is different than self-esteem. Self-esteem is this feeling like I'm a good person. I can, I'm a likable good person. Self-efficacy is I can make things happen. And I think the best way to become a hopeful person is to find ways to work on your self-efficacy, which means all kinds of things. Learn to play guitar, learn to do some sort of craft, get better at some sport, anything that develops the sense that if I work at this and then I can achieve something and I have some pride, builds on your faith. Because I really can't help you with your hope. I can help you with your faith. Right? Yep. And so if you have more faith in yourself, I can make things work in life. I'm capable of making my life work. That thing will draw you through this. Because the thing you're afraid of is, if I don't reach that hope, is this going to destroy me? And you have to feel like a person, no, it's not going to destroy me. It's going to be upsetting, but I'll be here on the other end because I'm good at things, And then there's all these qualities that I've heard you talk about before, which is these qualities that go with social estrangement. It's very hard to hope and not have a lot of social support, a lot of purpose, to feel a lot of loneliness, to feel isolated. It's very hard to have faith in those moments. Because these are what they call social resources. These are resources in social psychology, and they really hold you up during the most difficult times,
So really kind of what you're talking about is competence creates confidence in a certain way, right? Like this idea that when you know that you can accomplish something, anything, then it builds this sense of competence, like your own self-efficacy, to use the proper terminology, I suppose. So you start to learn like, oh, well, I learned this thing, I succeeded at this thing. And I think that's also one of the, and I think you covered this in the book as well. And I had a great podcast with a coach named Jerzy Gregorek, who talked about micro progressions. Like really instead of this big extrinsic goal, like I got to lose 50 pounds, and if you come up short from that, you're a failure, and all the shame comes in, and you have all of that fear of not reaching that. Be like, I'm going to go through today, and I'm going to eat a little better, and I'm going to move a little more, and that's going to be my win for the day. And that's that is my own championship for today, and that's it. And you get through that one day, and you're like, good job, man. Good job. Not showing up on the scale yet, but that's all right. Let's add another day, and let's add another day. And then that becomes this intrinsic process where you're just involved in the moment. It's almost like you collapse that extrinsic goals just short enough, and it almost kind of becomes intrinsic in a way because you're just involved in the process of it when the goals get micro enough that they're not some big thing looming in the future.
That's really great how you tied the intrinsic with the extrinsic goals. And that's exactly right. Yeah, that's exactly right. That's what this guy, Kurt Lewin, the guy that kind of invented social psychology, talked about, is that motivation happens in these units. You can have a long-term goal, but you have to have these little tiny units, of success, of some sort of accomplishment to make it through. Sad to say, it's the psychiatrist and What About Bob that talks about baby steps. but yeah, it's that process. One of the things that I took such delight in was how Mario Cuomo walked New York State through incremental steps. And he didn't walk New York State through incremental steps where everything was a success. But he still took those steps with them, and then he would tell them, this didn't work. Now we're going to try this. This didn't work. Now we're going to try this. And he held that entire state together by doing that, right? And when you look around about the chaos we now have in messages about COVID, there's none of those incremental steps to keep our hope going and keep our motivation going. And what starts happening? People start partying. They take off their masks. All the motivation to kind of hold us together starts to collapse because we don't have that sense of you described these incremental small achievements that we're all on board with,
Right. Yeah. Everybody's focused on this big fear paradigm that seems hopeless anyways. So in the face of abject hopelessness, fuck it. Why do anything? And
exactly.
That's it. Let's keep digging into the vein of intrinsic versus extrinsic. And there's a I don't know what he is, social scientist, Eric Fromm, and he
Mhm.
talks about having versus being and how we've been intoxicated with this idea of having things as a way to achieve happiness rather than being something as the true way to achieve happiness. And all of the research shows that having stuff doesn't make you fucking happy. It just doesn't. All of these extrinsic goals, we think that if we just get to this place, everything's going to be good. It's just not real. It's a fantasy.
Yeah. He's one of my favorites, and the book is trying to bring back a kind of thinking from back then. When I was in college, you walk into a bookstore and there are books by him in there. And this is a guy who was a psychoanalyst and Marxist. And now you go to bookstores and it's how to get rid of your anxiety, right? His was about, let's think about what anxiety is in the modern world, And my book's an attempt to bring back some of that thought, When Fromm wrote that, there were no storage units in the entire United States. Now there's more storage units than McDonald's. So he's writing about having. He had no idea that having would be these things where we have so much that we can't even keep it in our house, right? But that philosophy of having and not being leads to us too. We begin to think of ourselves as things to have, as units, as machines. And so all you have to do is pick up that instruction manual on how to change, and we can fix ourselves. And we're trying to fix ourselves so that we can fit in, not to be original. And so it becomes this act of conformity. Can I be just like the other mower in the long line of mowers at Home Depot? Right? And that's what he was worried about, is this what he called alienation, this world where we're just always just trying to kind of look like one another and become like one another and just become quote unquote functional, which, I've been in this field for almost 30 years. I still don't know what functional means.
It's on a gradient. That's for damn sure.
Yeah.
It's also when you talk about this kind of mechanization of how we look at ourselves and looking at ourselves as a machine. Well, one of the qualities of a machine is you can run diagnostics on it. And I think for many, many years, that was difficult to do. Obviously, there's metrics of how much money you have, but nobody was like running around with their bank account, on their fucking t-shirt or something like that, right? So it was all kind of like hidden, and there was ways that you would suggest things. And of course, people recognized those that had money and power, et cetera. But now with social media, there's an actual metric. And I think a lot of us get stuck in that trap where, oh, how many followers do you have? Okay, well, that's your worth to the tribe, in quotes, to the tribe. Your worth to the tribe is how many people are listening to what you have to say, how many people are liking your photos. If you're putting out photos of you being attractive, however many people follow you and like you is a validation of how attractive you are. If you're putting out anything, you have this metric to go by, which then further leads to this kind of commoditization of the essence of who we are, judging it based on an external metric. So our whole existence becomes extrinsic to a certain degree.
Exactly. Yeah. Like I turned to my wife yesterday, and I'm going to be on the Aubrey Marcus show. And how many bangles should I get for my wrist?
Power amulets are needed.
All the guys on it, they have all these bangles. It's like, dude, you're 58 years old. You're not going to put bangles on your wrist.
I'm glad you didn't go for the bangles. Although maybe it would have been good. Maybe it would have been one of those stories that your wife could tell about how cute you are, that really endear each other.
She doesn't always call it cute, but yeah. That sort of that force, that power of conformity is something that they were like worried about back then. I mean, it's weird to think about that. Actually, all the literature was this encroaching conformity since the 1950s and 60s. Now we're just sort of, it's there, it's just part of our lives. But they were terrified of this thing. Partly they're terrified of this because of the kind of conformity that happened 10 years before that. Auschwitz closed in 1945, 1955. Eric Fromm wrote this book. I mean, they were really worried about what it means when people don't think for themselves.
Right.
Right. I kind of pulled into these things.
Yep. All right. Shifting gears real quick. You taught me one of my new favorite words, and that is dramaturgy. Dramaturgy. This idea, and I'll let you explain it so I don't give the cliff notes of it. But I thought that was just a brilliant way to think about how we go about our lives in so many different cases when we're worried about what other people think. Not only what other people think, but what we think about ourselves. So explain the concept of dramaturgy.
Well, this a lot of dramaturgy comes from this guy named Irving Goffman, who was just this great sociologist. He was just remarkable, and it was all about how to present yourself in everyday life and what you're supposed to do to to engage in something that makes everything seem normal, right? So one of the great experiments that they did in sociology school when I was an undergrad was they had us get on an elevator and go to the back of the elevator and face the back of the elevator. And just that little tiny act freaked everybody out on the elevator, right? Like, what the fuck is this guy doing? And it was just simply turning my back and facing the back of the elevator. So the dramaturgy is, this is what it's like to be in an elevator. We all face towards the door. That's the story we all live in. And by turning your back, you're changing the dramaturgy. And so these dramaturgies kind of control our lives on some level. You know, I've heard you talk about these stories control our lives. Well, dramaturgy is like a story. It's a story we all play into. There's more actors than one in a dramaturgy.
Right. Yeah, it's where you're putting on a performance for an audience, and based on the expectations that audience has, based on what you think they might like. But the interesting part is that you're part of that audience, like your own self. So even when nobody's around, we're still participating in our own little dramaturgy. A way that we're going about, a way that we're thinking about things, rationalizing things, coming up with excuses that we're only going to tell ourselves, justifications we're only going to tell ourselves. We're not even being real with ourselves because we're participating as the audience in this dramaturgy, once again, afraid of this, overbearing self-judge that we have that might criticize us or might make us shameful or might punish us in some way by the denial of our own self-love or whatever means that our judge has to withdraw something positive. So we're participating in this thing like, no, judge, like, you see, I could have worked, but this thing happened, or I'm not feeling so well, or blah, blah. And so we're participating in this game even when there's nobody else around.
Yep. I mean, that's right. That's exactly right. It's a fascinating thing in a way that we're just constantly living in these dramaturgies. To return to the Bengals metaphor, that was me making a comment on the dramaturgy of what it's like to be interviewed by you, that I'm sort of refusing to wear the costume of this. But anybody that knows me knows that's my dramaturgy.
Yeah. Even that self.
I'm the guy that does that thing. Yeah, I'm the guy that does that thing. So there's even a story behind that. There's a drama to that.
What's the way to step off stage? How do we step off stage? I mean, awareness is a key thing. I mean, I think even just reading this and understanding the concept of dramaturgy gives you the awareness when you're playing a role for yourself and for an audience. But beyond awareness, is there another way that you would recommend somebody can just, all right, enough's enough. I'm stepping off the stage here.
Well, I do have a slight answer to that, but I think it has to do more with just, my answer will have more to do with more issues of awareness, because Aubrey, I'm just interested in awareness. I'm not so interested in telling people how to do things, because I think that awareness drives us. That I have enough faith in people that if I can get through to them, these awarenesses might help them, if that makes sense. More than if I say, here's how you do this thing, I think that play, for me in my own life, play is the fundamental objective. And what I mean by that is the experience that I am engaged with somebody else or the world in a way where I have input, but it has input too, and we're creating something new. And dramaturgical situations often don't have that. What you have in those is this sort of no play. It's just drama. And I think that our orientation should always be, how do I get to that place of play? Yeah. And the place of play, I feel like, it's right, you and me. I feel like it's happening right now with you and me. I'm trying to understand what you're You're asking, you're trying to understand what I'm saying. We're trying to get to a common meaning, some common understanding. That's the place we all want to be in. And that requires a certain level of risk to improvise, to just begin wherever you are and not go the route of one story or one idea. I don't know if that's helpful, but that's...
Yeah, totally. When you mentioned play, it occurred to me, one of the things that I offer for my masterminds, like the Fit for Service Fellowship and different, coaching things that I provide, is ecstatic dance. And the purpose of ecstatic dance is to push you into movement patterns where you're absolutely not thinking about it, not judging yourself, and just radically responding, creating that, collapsing the sound to the way that your body moves without any watcher, without any judge, without anything else. So you're just actually free, free from those watchful eyes. You're free from any drama. Nobody's watching you. You're not watching yourself. And so you're actually able to just escape from that. And it's just this kind of structured form of play where you enter this space where there's this radical no judgment agreement, and the lights are usually low. I mean, there's different containers you can set. But for a lot of people, this is hard even by themselves. Like for listeners right now, I would challenge you to go into a room. You can shut all the lights off. Definitely don't want to be looking in the mirror. It's going to make it harder. Unless you want to go the advanced level, then look right in the mirror and do it. But nonetheless, like, go in there and just start moving around. If you're a guy, like, start moving your hands, wobbling your hands and wiggling your hips and doing all of these things that are really uncomfortable because you're participating in the dramaturgy of, I'm a masculine man, and a masculine man doesn't move his hands when he dances, and a masculine man doesn't move his hips. But that's just a dramaturgy. That's just a constraint that you're putting on yourself, playing a role to reinforce to yourself, I'm a masculine man, I'll show myself. Well, what? You don't have to prove that. Allow yourself to be who you are.
Yeah. That's great. That's really great. Yeah. That's really great.
And that's what play is, that when you really just lose yourself, when you really get down on it. And that's why kids are so great. My nieces and nephews, it's just, when you really get into it, you're just collapsing this idea of how you should act and what you should be. And you're just flowing. If something can make them laugh, you do it. If they can make you laugh, you do it. And the sillier you get, usually the greater the reward. The play gets more fun. Everything gets more fun. And you're not thinking about how that reflects on you or whatever else it is. And if you are, it's not play. It's not really going to work. If you're trying to impress that kid's parent or whatever you're trying to do, then you're back in the dramaturgy construct, rather than in the actual play construct, which is, if we can live our life as play, man, we made it.
I know. I mean, I think though, there's ways of thinking about play as, no, I agree. I mean, first of all, what does it take to play? It takes some ability, some faith that you have the ability to contribute something to this event, and some belief that when you see a barrier in this event, you can get around it. Those are the two outcomes of hope. So you can't play without hope. You have to have some level of hope in it. And for me, hope is the kernel of everything regarding our interactions. And when a child is trying to get a parent to interact with them, it's play. The child is doing all these little tiny things to get the parent to interact. I think what they're doing is being hopeful. And when the parent doesn't interact, they're being destroyed by the disappointment of the parent not interacting. So all attachment, what?
That's a lot of pressure for a parent.
You're going to fail. I'm going to tell you right now. I mean, we all are. But the fact is that at that very moment is the moment where hope is generated. I don't believe that people have attachment disorders. I think they have perturbed relationships with hope. I hoped my parent didn't come. I hoped they didn't give me the right response. And all of that comes out of an act of play. I'm going to point across the room, see if they'll follow my finger pointing. I'm going to give a giggle. I'm going to do all these things that are trying to get them to interact with me in this playful manner. And if I'm let down a bunch of times, I begin to kind of give up on play, And play, that thing where you're innovatively thinking and acting with others to create something new, is basically just fundamentally the most human thing there is, because we're built to innovate things together. That's what we do that other animals don't. We innovate things as a group. And so play is the thing that gets us to our most humane place, which is, how do I get along with others to create something new together?
And it's shocking the effects that can happen when you actually release into play
Mm-hmm.
and then someone slaps you for it.
Yeah.
Right. And you give a great example of this. And I forget the pseudonym that you used for one of your patients, but he was dancing around playing, had a really stern authoritarian father, bumps a record player
Mm-hmm.
and gets, sternly reprimanded.
Right.
And that was a trauma that he carried for his life, that you ended up having to work with. I know examples of this myself. My former partner was singing, loved singing. Singing was her way to like let her soul kind of come through her little, innocent child, expression. And then one day some comment from her mom was, I don't like your voice. It sounds terrible, blah, blah, blah. And there it was,
Yeah.
closed it up. And she's
Yeah.
still working to this day to feel comfortable to really release it. And ostensibly she's an amazing singer, but that one traumatic moment, it just makes an imprint that's really hard. So in your practice, when you have somebody that's had an imprint like this, take us through like some of the steps. How do you water the garden to allow them to kind of release this trauma?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, I kind of want to name it. I want to get it out of the world of clinical language and talk about these experiences we all have with hope. So I want to name it and I want to bring it down out of the professional realm. That what you're experiencing could be something I've experienced because this is how it's been for me. And how can we begin to have a conversation where we look at the pain of these kinds of disappointments and take them seriously as real injuries? We could call them traumas, but if we call them traumas too much, we won't recognize the meaning of them. And the meaning of them is this place where you felt like you could be spontaneous and joyous and it was taken from you. And that's profound. And so then it's really a conversation about how deeply painful it is to have those kinds of experiences. And I found that those kind of conversations are better than saying we're treating your trauma.
Right.
It just brings it down to a more human level and a level where we can understand each other and they can feel my compassion for them. I'm not feeling compassion for what's wrong with them. I'm having compassion for what happened to them because we have a shared understanding of what happened. And that's a much more important kind of conversation.
Yeah. You talk a bit about how there's a couple things that people do. One is in some way, as a response to this injury that they received, they want to create a monument to that. And that's the psychology behind not actually overcoming that injury because of the injustice that you felt, because of the pain you felt. There's this thing that goes on in our mind where we think that if we continue to punish ourselves, then somehow that'll be retribution to the perpetrator of such actions. Right. And so you can get stuck in this thing where you're trying to actually even the scales of justice from this thing that you felt by actually not moving past it, by not changing.
Yeah. It's a very tragic thing to me because memorials are really important. And when we tear down a memorial, other than when it's a Southern Confederate soldier, when we tear down a memorial, we're doing something kind of blasphemous. You're ruining something sacred, and it's sacred because it's holding some sort of important memory. So when we become a memorial to our past, in other words, if I change, people aren't going to recognize how hurt I was because if I'm doing well, then the injury couldn't have been that bad. Right? The only way I can make sure people understand that I was injured is to stay in a bad place, to stay destroyed. To me, that makes a lot of sense that a person would want to do that because they are giving up something. They are giving up a sort of injustice if they move forward, right? And so it's a very understandable thing to want that memorial, but it also keeps you in a place where you're in a place of suffering and not moving forward in life.
Well, it's a great paradox because it's understandable, but absolutely illogical as well and counterproductive. So it's both of those things. Like,
yeah.
But it's I think again awareness. When you're in this, you have to recognize if you're keeping any memorials to your pain.
Right.
If you're keeping any way that you want to hold on to something, to show people what you've experienced. And you talk about how it's important for people to talk about and to share these experiences multiple times so that it's kind of remembered. It's in the collective consciousness of the people around them. And then that's helpful to allow them to let it go, because then it's almost like they take their memorial from having to be internal, and then they can just kind of allow the memories that are held by multiple different people to kind of keep that memory alive.
Yeah.
And then that helps them move on. But just the awareness that, you may be holding on to something as a means to actually memorialize something that happened, but that's really not helping anything. It's not helping. I mean, it's understandable. You're doing it for an adaptive reason. Like, got it. But now, can we make a different choice? Can we make a more productive choice for our happiness and for our growth and for our life?
Yeah. I think that's exactly right. I think I would phrase it a little differently to a person, which is not, it's maladaptive or anything, but what a beautiful thing you've done for yourself. You've created this memorial. It just is really understandable. Do you want to keep it? You know what I mean?
Yes.
Maybe you do still want to keep it. And that's completely understandable, because you built this beautiful kind of language in your behavior that says what happened to you. But you know what else? We've been together for a long time, and I can hold on to this memorial. You can move on, and I will know what happened to you. And I think that's what you're saying. You get it into other people's heads,
Right.
It's never going away. Even when you've quit therapy with me, I'll always hold it in my head. I'm the ark kind of controlling the covenant of your pain,
Man, I can see how effective you are as a therapist, because what you, even in that hypothetical example, this kind of, it elicited a giggle in me, just because it was so loving, and it was so like supportive, didn't create any shame at all. It allowed somebody, it recognized like, I see why you're doing it, and beautifully done. Like it's a beautiful memorial. And do you want to keep it? And then it gives them the agency. It doesn't rob them of any choice. It's absolutely their choice. This is a beautiful thing you've created. Do you want to keep it? And they're like, oh, now I get to choose. Now I'm not shamed for having this, and I get to choose a different way. And I think that's just great example for anybody, because we all act as therapists at different points to different people we love. People will come to us and talk. And so when anybody comes to any of us with something that's going on, if we can understand the process that they're in and how that's adaptive and beautiful, and even using that word like, wow, that's beautiful what you've created here, and do you want to keep it? And then I just think that's a really powerful way to support somebody.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for saying that. Yeah. Yeah. I have this idea in my head that someday, because I speak at substance abuse events all the time, someday I'm going to have the guts to go up there and talk about how amazing liquor is. I mean, it's just like amazing.
Yeah.
The flavors they create, it's just an amazing world. That's hard to give up. It's a beautiful thing. Liquor is a beautiful thing. It's an art. Instead of this thing like liquor's bad. No, it's and that human beings figured out a way to get themselves drunk. That's just like remarkable. But you have to give it up. But let's not act like it's a bad thing. Let's not act like it's bad. It's kind of a beautiful thing in some ways.
If there was a betting line to how effective that would be, I would put all my money on super effective.
Really?
Here's the thing. Here's the thing. Like when there's something that somebody's not telling us that we know to be true, like we know that single malt is so good. When you're having that Oban 14 with the single rock at the end of the night, you're having whatever your mojito with a cigar out in some kind of steamy environment, like it's good. That glass of wine, these different things, like we know that. But if someone's not acknowledging that thing that we know, we tend to just kind of disregard like a lot of what they say. So, and I think that's a big issue that happened with the war on drugs movement, right? Like it was all drugs are bad, drugs are in all of this propaganda and bullshit. And as soon as you pierce the veil and you're like, actually, psilocybin's kind of awesome. As soon as you do that, then everything, they're completely discredited. They have no ground to stand on. And so when you overdo it or deny some truth that we know to be existent, you just lose all authority.
That's right.
Maybe not all, but you lose
Yeah.
a significant amount of the authority. So I think that approach, could revolutionize, substance abuse treatment, really talking about, fuck, this feels good. Even I haven't done it, but like, I imagine even someone talking about heroin that way, like, whoa, like that's an amazing feeling that it provides. I get it. But nonetheless, here are the consequences, of course, as we all know. But even that thing, it just engenders this trust, like, oh yeah, they get it. They
Right.
get that this is something that really feels good and it's an escape, and they get the reasons why I'm doing it. I can only imagine that would be highly effective.
Yeah, maybe I'll get the guts to do it.
Well, I'll be cheering you on from afar. Not that my cheers matter at all, but I'll be cheering you on.
What Mate says, that there's one substance for despair, and that's heroin.
Mhm.
So we take substances for depression, we take substances for anxiety, we take substances for schizophrenia. If you want to treat despair, that's the one.
Wow.
Yeah.
Just comes with pretty heavy side effects.
It does. Yeah.
But yeah, again, that goes to his incredibly important reframe, which is, instead of this shame and this judgment and this you're broken and you're fucked up and you're an addict and all of these different things, and you're a criminal and all of these different ways that we just put labels on people and drive them into the shadows, saying, look, you're just attempting to solve a problem.
Right.
Here are the tools you're using to solve the problem. Here's the cost of using these tools.
Right.
And let me give you some different tools.
Right.
That's such a much better way to do it.
It is. And then I don't know if I'm going too off subject, but then it gets into what the current trends do with that kind of thinking. The current trends are, you are what they call co-occurring. You have these two things going on for you. You have a mental illness and a substance abuse. And so you really now have to go to this center, because you really do need to go put away, because we got to work on these two issues now. And you got to go to this program in Malibu where we're going to work on these two issues. It's not one anymore. And so his argument that this is something going on psychologically and deep for the person can get manipulated quickly into these schemes about treatment that don't work,
Right.
And it's just everywhere. It's everywhere. In Florida, California, it's everywhere. This movement towards making lots of money off of this substance abuse stuff, where the practices aren't very good,
No. You listed a stat that said that the majority of people that quit habitual drinking do it on their own without treatment. And the ones that do it on their own have much longer lasting effects than the ones that have gone to a treatment center.
Yeah.
Right. So it's like the treatment center, it's not that the treatment center is a bad idea. And I'm sure there's certain circumstances where it's an important intervention, I suppose, is what it actually is.
Mm-hmm.
But they're missing some key components, because if you're actually offering something like that, it should be the most effective way.
Right.
That's
right.
And if they're not, they got to just rethink some things, that get around and say, like, all right, let's start from scratch. Let's read your book, and let's talk to Gabor, and then let's figure some things out and try to make this the most effective way to handle, substance abuse issues.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I'm not against these programs. I'm against the sales pitch, though.
Yeah.
Right? Because the sales pitch is, if you don't do this, you're in denial. Something screwed up about you that you're not doing this. And yet I'm talking you to something that might not work. Right? That's like a bad sales pitch, but yeah.
It's interesting too now. I mean, with everything that's going on socially, there's a lot of talk about being a sex addict, and then people going to sex addict treatment. But it seems like it's just they're checking the box in this dramaturgy, in which they have a mob that's angry. And then so in the dramaturgy, they say, yes, I'm an addict. And they say, okay. You're no longer to blame. You acknowledge you're an addict. Now go get the approved treatment. And I don't know the stats on, sex addiction treatment centers, but I can't imagine they're very good. And I don't even know what sex addiction necessarily is. You probably know as a clinician what that definition is, but it's interesting how this is not only with substances, this is with behaviors as well. And this kind of model, and then the places popping up to treat this, it's kind of interesting.
Yeah. I mean, we're taking the problem of habits and making them in these pathologies, instead of saying, when is it problematic and when is it not? Right. Because on the continuum of sex addict, a lot of sexual behavior is habitual and and addictive and something you can't hold back from, right?
Mhm.
And that's what sex is. So to start calling it, you know what I'm saying? It becomes this sort of thing. Now it can become problematic, but it's the same thing. And to call it addiction makes it sound like it's this disease instead of it's just this habit we all have has become problematic.
Right.
Right. I mean, I do agree with Mate that all addiction is related to our attachments and our need to feel this sense of connectedness,
Mhm.
you know, and that a sense of well-being in the world and connected, and that the drugs we take get you to those places. They play on the same things that play in our brains when we're connected. I'm sure you know all that, but all the stuff that goes on our brain when we feel connected, all the stuff that makes my dog go insane when I walk in the house, right? He's on these drugs right now because I'm home, right?
That would, by the way, that would be the best drug ever. If you could take dog excitement when the owner comes home drug, man, that would be the best. I don't think there's anything out there that does that. That's the good stuff right there.
We'd all be running around with a sock in our mouth.
For sure. Can you imagine your wife comes home and you're like, honey, oh my God, I'm so excited to see you. It's been so long. She's like, I just went to the store. You're like, I know. But that hour was excruciating.
But it's all about that, you know. Aren't you addicted to your wife? I'm addicted to my wife.
Yeah.
Is that a bad thing? It's called being connected, attached. You know, it's just part of what attachment is. You know?
Yeah. Well, the impetus to pathologize something is an impetus to be exculpable. It's an impetus to just push away any guilt, any shame you feel for doing that. You're saying, I have a pathology. I'm a broken machine, and this is something that happened, and I need a treatment intervention to fix it. And I think there's so many ways that we go about doing that, but it's a way of just shrugging the responsibility and autonomy of actually having agency. Saying,
That's right.
I had no agency. You know, I got this thing, and that's it. And it's a game that we play with ourselves, and it's a game we play societally to really remove ourselves from any judgment.
That's right. I think it's personal, but I also think it's a profound. And this is one of the things I really try to avoid in the company I own and in my own treatment and in my book is that it's also a profound act of power. There's a famous French philosopher named Michel Foucault who talked about this, which is basically what he called the clinical gaze, which is if I get to be the person that decides what's normal and abnormal, I have profound power, right? If I get to say to you, you're sick, you're not, you're sick, you're not, that's the same kind of power as a priest saying you're sinful, you're not, you're sinful, you're not. And we live in this society where things have become so psychiatric that power is being exerted on people just constantly.
Yeah.
You know,
it's interesting because there's, you know, in some of the research I've done, the DSM, Diagnostic Statistics Manual, that all psychiatrists use, that's decided in true Council of Nicaea fashion, where there's 12 men sitting around a room and just kind of debating what they classify as a disease or not a disease, you know, and what I was really focused on was an interesting game that was being played between grief and depression, in which grief and depression had overlapping symptoms. There's 8 symptoms in the DSM for grief and depression.
Yeah.
And so in DSM-3, we're now on 5, DSM-3 was from like 1980, there was a 1-year grief exemption. So if something, you know, ostensibly bad happened in your life and you were experiencing these symptoms, well, then you weren't clinically depressed, you were just grieving, but only up to a year. Day 366, you're clinically depressed, you know, take some Prozac.
Yeah.
And then in DSM-4, it went down to 2 months. And they're like, a year is far too long to grieve. 2 months. On day 62, you know, take some pills. And then now in DSM-5, it's down to 2 weeks. So if your spouse dies, you got 2 weeks to grieve. And then if you're still exhibiting those symptoms, you know, lack of energy, lack of motivation, you know, depressed mood, you know, this whole host of symptoms, well, then you're clinically depressed. But it's just 12 dudes sitting around deciding that.
Right.
You know, it's not like they're looking at other markers. They're like, well, 2 weeks.
It's like in high school playing a game that your friend invented. And then he keeps changing the rules. He's like, no, it's this rule now.
Yeah, totally.
No, I mean, you know, like, I think it's 1974, a bunch of psychiatrists sitting around a room in Washington, D.C., There's gay rights activists outside the door fighting the diagnosis of homosexuality as being a pathology. And they say, who here thinks homosexuality is a pathology now? And the majority of them don't raise their hands. And then they go, okay, homosexuality is no longer a pathology. And on that day, it stopped being a pathology in the DSM. And the day before, it was a pathology.
And
that's just insane.
It's so important for people to understand, because when these concepts are obscured and then they just get reinforced and told so many times, then people just don't even question anything. They're like, oh yeah, it's a pathology. Well, all right. It was some dudes. I don't think they're malicious at all. I think they're just doing their best. They're trying to figure stuff out, but they're just trying to figure stuff out.
Yeah.
This is what's happening. It doesn't mean that we have to absolutely accept it and also put ourselves in this machine-like cookie cutter thing. Man, it may take you 3 years to grieve the death of your spouse or your child or your family. And there's all these micro grief experiences we have, when we lose some aspect of our identity. And this is the part that I'm getting really curious about, is like, there's these accepted grief constructs. Oh, someone died. You got a divorce. You lost this job in a catastrophic way, whatever. Those are acceptable. And you can tell that story in your own dramaturgy, and people are like, oh, wow, yeah, I totally understand what you're going through. But when you have an idea about your identity, and we're deeply identified with that identity construct, like the stories we tell about ourselves, a lot of times those stories have to change. Just reality is different than those stories. So part of our story about ourselves dies.
Yeah.
And then that's when something dies and you can no longer change it. The response is grief. You have your grieving period for the story about yourself.
Yes.
And so that's happening all the time too. But it's hard to explain that to somebody like, well, I really thought I was going to be a famous singer. And now I realize, after releasing that first song and nobody really liked it, I'm just not going to be a singer. Well, that's an opportunity that I think we all take to grieve. That's a death of the character you thought you were going to be.
Right. Exactly. And as a matter of fact, to get back to this idea of perturbed grief, typically why a person stays in that state is they're not grieving the loss of that person. They're grieving the fracture in their identity. Who am I now without this husband? Who am I going to be? And so it's called this psychological thing of grief. But what they're really going through is, how do I rebuild myself? I'm going through these struggles. It's not the grief of losing that person. It's the grief of what you're talking about. And then not being able to find a new story, right? That's kind of the typical reason why a person's in perturbed grief. It's not perturbed grief. It's perturbed identity confusion, right?
Wow.
I mean, if that fits with what you're saying, but that's
absolutely.
Really
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's a good way to just say that, just highlight the importance of understanding how much we protect and how we think our identity is really life or death. And it's like, this is the building we built with all the stucco and the scaffold and everything else. And we got this thing in our mind, and then a wrecking ball comes in and takes out some of this because you failed at something or you don't believe anything's possible. And then grief is that period where you're looking at your materials and you're like, shit, I got to rebuild. I got to call the architect. I got to figure some stuff out. And if you don't have enough faith in yourself and you don't have a belief in your own agency, you might be like, I'm never going to be able to rebuild anything. My life's just going to be in rubble.
Right.
So we suffer these identity challenges, and then it's just like, well, fuck it. I'm not even going to try to rebuild because something else is going to come smash this building again. And then, might as well just stay here in the rubble.
But you see, you just described a whole meaning to this event. Perturbed grief reaction has no meaning. It just doesn't. It's a label, and it's a label that the person who's being labeled with doesn't mean anything to them. So it's sort of the sickness I have. It's not a process. It's not an event that we can have some compassion for, right? That, oh, that's what's going on for the person. There's a story behind this. There's an event. It's not what's wrong. It's what's happening. And that kind of thing takes some work. And diagnoses can destroy that. I actually go, when I give talks, I actually bring out the DSM and I say, this book should be put next to this book. And I hold out the Peterson Guide for Birds. It's like, these are just the same thing. Right. And we really want to be applying this to our minds because it's the same thing,
Yeah.
I was diagnosed with really severe learning disability when I was a kid, and I was going to go on the short bus. I was going to go to this different school and be removed from my friends, and my parents resisted it, and thank God they did, because I would have developed this whole identity as a disabled person.
Mhm.
But things were tough. It was tough. I didn't know how to kind of behave and get through my classes because I couldn't pay attention, that kind of stuff, hyperactive stuff. But now I'm convinced there's all these other disorders that people aren't looking at. Lack of curiosity disorder, lack of imagination disorder, lack of innovation disorder. These are serious fucking disorders. Mine, I couldn't do some math and write. I can live with that one. I don't know how I'd live with the other ones.
Right.
And now I know my problem was I didn't do well in a factory school.
Right.
I didn't do well with that kind of teaching. There's no disorder there. People with these tension issues, they become entrepreneurs. That's what they do. They have pretty damn good lives, but it was labeled in that kind of way, like I was broken, tainted,
It's almost like it's almost in this position where everything is a disorder or nothing is a disorder. And each human being is just going through their process, right? Like you can talk about every little micro thing as a disorder, or you can talk about nothing as a disorder, and just a way that a human is adapting to their environment and responding in ways that make sense and based upon their own, intrinsic nature, and also based upon the environment that they're in.
Yeah. Yeah. I just saw a commercial the other day for medicine for the bumps on the back of your arm. I don't know why you have to get rid of the bumps on the back of your arm. I just don't. And they had a name for this disorder of bumps on the back of your arm. It's like, what?
Wow.
It's like, but that is the world we live in. This world that's just pathologizing everything to sell a good.
Right. And that's the motivation, and I think, again, people will blind themselves, and they'll think, well, bumps on the back of your arm, it's a real problem. It creates, self-esteem issues, and
Right.
these can have downstream effects. And this is important that we release this bumps on the arm medicine. And I think they convince themselves of that, but really, like, they're not aware of their subconscious motivation. I want to make some money, like that's really what's going on. I don't think people are intentionally malicious, hardly ever.
Right.
I think they're just stuck in some kind of justification where they're not aware of what their real motivation is.
Right. I agree with you. But the result is profound disabling of our autonomy. This feeling like we're constantly not enough, we're not doing enough, and the book's trying to say, relax on that a little bit. There's reasons that you're staying the same, and they're self-loving. They're not bad reasons. They may make your life a little more fucked up than if you tried, but they're also understandable.
Mm-hmm.
Because that world does worry me. This kind of problem-saturated world.
Yeah. It's and like you said, I think there's a lot of things that happen when you label someone a certain thing. It becomes co-opted into their identity construct, and then they're going to have to reckon with that, and sometimes with positive effects or negative effects. If someone's labeled, gifted and talented, that was the program that was going on when I was in school, and you're in the gifted and talented program, and maybe that makes you more gifted and talented, but it also sets up an expectation that you're always going to be gifted and talented.
Yeah.
And so you have this new judgment criteria based on this expectation of your perceived performance. And so there's all of these things at play based on this label. That's, just something to be aware of. As soon as you start sticking a label on somebody, they have to reconcile that.
Yeah. Do you know about the this guy Kipling Williams research on ostracism and pain?
Mm-mm.
So he's a social psychologist, and he has people play this game called Cyberball, and all it is these two people. It's a little image of these two people throwing a ball, and then you join the game, and then you throw the ball to them, and they throw the ball back and forth. They throw the ball to you, and then slowly they stop throwing the ball back to you. And the subject is in an fMRI machine. And the part of their brain that responds to pain completely lights up while they're doing this stupid game. It's just a stupid little game. And they're in a complete mode of pain, even though they're not being touched. Now, Williams now tells people, the two people on that game you're playing with, there's nobody there. They're not real people. It's just a computer program. The same part of the brain lights up.
Wow.
That's how powerfully oriented we are to the fear of ostracism, of being kicked out, right? You're going to be left behind by the tribe. You better watch it. It's the pain warning you, right? And so this idea of ever being on the outside is this powerful thing that's just controlling our lives all the time. It's just in our brains.
Do you trace that back to any evolutionary biology roots in which ostracization from the tribe meant probably certain death in the struggles against nature and all of these things? Do you think that's where this developed, this pain to just kind of keep us in the tribe?
Yeah. And yes, I do. Yeah. Or keep us out of the tribe. Like, we're leaving you behind. And, oh shit, I better behave because I better be part of this group or I'm in big trouble. I got to figure out how to conform because they're going to leave me behind. Yeah. And so what kind of people were typically left behind? Typically people that were sick or disabled.
Mm-hmm.
So then National Alliance for Mentally Ill goes around saying, don't stigmatize people. They have a brain disease. That is the most absurd non-stigma campaign you can have.
Right. Right.
How about not stigmatize people, because people that are different often can provide really interesting insights into the world, and let's make a place for them because there's all kinds of ways and the world will get better if they're integrated.
It's almost like the script has flipped to a position where now it's not about whether you have something that's not your fault. It's whether if you're doing something that is your fault, that's what creates the ostrich, like getting pushed out of the tribe, right?
Yeah.
So if it's not your fault, we'll take care of you. Because we have the resources now. Back in those cold, hard days, back in the cold, hard days, it didn't matter whether it was your fault or not. If you couldn't pull your weight, we couldn't carry you. There's not enough food to go around. There's only a certain amount of buffalo kills we're going to get, and a way that we're going to actually be able to, move the camp, et cetera. If you can't actually do stuff, we can't feed you. But it's different now. Now we have the resources. So it's really now about these kind of judgments of character, judgments of someone's ethos, So as long as someone says, oh, it's not my fault, we're like, oh, cool, we'll take care of you. But if it's like, wow, you're really fucking this up and it is your fault, we're not going to take care of you at all.
I think that's a very good point. I also think, though, if we get back to the idea of dramaturgy, I'm at a restaurant. The dramaturgy is the waiter comes to the table and we have a nice meal. And all of a sudden this person comes in and he's talking to himself really loudly. He doesn't fit in the play. I don't want him in here. This is a different story. I was here for dinner. Now I'm doing a play with a schizophrenic. I mean, I'm just saying, ostracism comes in then, right? It's like you're disturbing the story we're trying to live right now.
Right.
And we have these strict stories that do not allow difference in.
That's it's interesting. I think one of the benefits of, I've been on the plant medicine journey. You probably followed my story for over 20 years. And one of the beautiful things about sitting in an ayahuasca circle is lots of random crazy things happen. There's people who will exhibit any variety of different strange behaviors in there, but always the shamans and the medicine people who are, facilitating, they'll always say, no matter what happens with anybody else, this is part of your experience. And know that there's value in this experience for you. This isn't happening. This isn't going wrong for you. So take whatever's happening. So for example, the first time I actually drank ayahuasca, there was a woman next to me who got stuck in a mental loop. And she just kept saying over and over, I can't tell if I actually shit my pants or I imagine I shit my pants. She said it for 45 minutes straight.
Mm-hmm.
And she was just stuck there in this loop. And and I was like, I would have to catch myself getting frustrated, stop saying that.
Right.
And then finally have this kind of peace and acceptance for her experience. And then how I was interacting with her experience, the judgment that I had about her experience, the way that I felt entitled to this noble silence or whatever this thing that I had. And so it became these deep lessons for me. And I think we can take the lessons from ceremony, one of the reasons it's valuable is we take these and then we apply these to ordinary life. So if that person comes in the restaurant and they're acting like this, okay, this is an opportunity for me to learn. I didn't know I was showing up at the restaurant to learn this lesson, but here I am. And this is my opportunity to learn and learn non-judgment, learn acceptance, learn, to be able to continue my experience without it being interrupted. So it's just a way to reframe everything.
I think that's really great. I think that Yeah, I think that really captures what happens in these experiences and why it makes life so good after. I hadn't really figured out, other than waking up, you know,
Right.
um, you're waking up to a world where you begin to question the dramaturgies around you. You're more accepting of this, what's happening, in that kind of way. Yeah. I think that really is part of what attracts me to plant medicine. What makes me feel like I'm, when I come back to the world, what I've gained from it.
Yeah.
And it really is about, how can we get in this place where we can live with uncertainty, where uncertainty is a good thing. It's a beautiful thing. And how can we be in these places where uncertainty is a thing that we want on some level, and that seems to be one of the things it also does.
Well, the way I like to think about that is, think about a video game. Imagine if you knew exactly where every monster was going to come from, exactly the moves they were going to make, everything was known. It would be just a really shitty movie.
Right.
But the reason we like video games is the uncertainty.
Right.
Like, we like that. So why would we want our life to be any different? Why would we want to have a life where everything was certain and played out? We would just be passive participants in a movie, not actually the character of our own heroic novel, our own video game.
Yep.
Played out in real life with the greatest controller you could possibly imagine, a human being,
No, that's also really what, really good psychotherapy. That's what it is. It's improv. You're just doing improv. I mean, that's what you're doing. You're doing improv not for an audience. You're doing improv to help another person loosen up, have a different view of the world. But you don't know where that session's going. It's not a video game, right? We don't know what we're going to create here. And that's the kind of psychological good we all need. It's just every interaction, we don't know where this is headed. We're going to, and what does that do? That makes us listen to each other. I don't know where this is headed, but I better listen hard to what the person's saying, because no one else is going to help me with this. Right? You and I didn't know where this was going to head.
Nope.
Right? And what made it enjoyable for me, at least, was feeling some level of connection to you, because we were both trying to understand each other, because we had nothing else available but trying to understand each other. We weren't in the middle of a video game,
Right. Yeah. I think, Alan Watts, gives a great talk about that, how this is what we're living right now is exactly how we would design it. Like, this is it, with immense challenges and the forgetting of where we came from, the forgetting of, the unborn and undying nature of who we are. And of course, that's not something that's provable, whatever. That's a deep belief that I hold, and I think he held as well. But we would want to be in this situation where the stakes were really high, where there was pain and pleasure. Like, we're living it. We're living the absolute best game possible, like, where this is what we would want. And even everything that's going on in the world, if you're watching a movie, look at any X-Men or Avengers or whatever, there's always an immense challenge in the world. And it's even historical, William Wallace from Braveheart, 300, whatever. There's an immense existential challenge, and that's what calls the heroes forward. So what are we going to do? We're going to lament everything that's going on and like, oh man, look at all this. No, be like, all right, cool. Like, this is the time. This is the time. Let's rally, let's rally our own fellowship. Let's call our own Avengers, and let's see what we can do. And if we succeed, fucking awesome. If we don't, we go out on our shield.
That's really great. That's really great. Because it means we get the chance to be as human as possible.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And just try to enjoy this along the way, enjoy and appreciate. And I think that's a beautiful thing that you do in the book, is appreciate your desire for sameness. Appreciate the desire for the small comfort of that bite of food, or the small thing that you're trying to do, the alcohol that you're drinking. Like, appreciate all that. And then take your agency, take your responsibility with radical self-acceptance. Be like, all right, what do I want to choose now?
Right. I mean, sameness comes from self-love, and love is a broken thing that never does a perfectly good job. Right? So sameness is like your parents' love. They overstep sometimes. They understep sometimes. They're constantly failing in how they're expressing it. But you can still love your parents. You can still say they're doing the best they can, And that sameness is the party that's like, hey, put on your seatbelt. this is scary, right? Take it easy, don't risk too much. And that's okay.
Yeah.
What would life be like without that at all? It'd just be miserable,
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, it would be why. I mean, you'd be constantly putting yourself in the fray, and you'd be constantly worn down. If there wasn't that opposing force, just being like, just chill for a minute. You don't need any more gains this week. Like, just relax. Just take a breather here.
yeah.
So it's important.
Yeah, there's a great line in this motivational interviewing, this model for working with people with addiction, which is, don't call it resistant, call it the client telling you to slow down. Right? They're not right. They're not like resistant. They're saying, hey man, okay, I get it. Let's just take it a little easy here.
Yeah.
I am changing. I am listening. I am going along, but let's just do this in the right pace.
Yeah, pacing is crucial, and it's real easy to cause a lot of damage when you go faster than the pacing that is required. And that could be from working out. Let's say you haven't worked out in a year, and you just go to a CrossFit class. All right, you're probably going to hurt yourself. And if like going to the extreme isn't the way, it's just like, all right, let's ease into this. Let's get acclimated to it. And let's just slowly through micro progression, add a little bit more weight, a little bit more intensity, and kind of ramp up.
Mm-hmm.
But that's something that takes, patience and like a clear vision of where you're going, to kind of do. And it's easy to mess that up. I mean, I certainly, messed that up when I was experimenting and exploring polyamory, right? It was like, okay, we're monogamous. And then it's like, all right, now we're doing it. Polyamory, we're going for it. And then both me and my partner, Whitney, we both just freaked out. We're like, and then we had to like recover from all the freakouts and everything, where it would have been like, should have just taken our time and talked about it more. And, but, there is some value that comes from just diving in head first into the cold water, but it creates a lot of collateral damage that you got to clean up if you do it that way.
Yeah. It's messy. I mean, in my company, we think a lot about pacing because we're talking about people who have had such profound experiences of disappointment because of how they've been treated for their psychiatric issue and what's happened because of it. So how do you kind of help them recover in this pacing kind of way? And the fact is, there's never the perfect pace. There's no such thing. You're just trying to get an approximate. Whenever you're dealing with pacing, you're dealing with frustration because it's either too slow or too fast. It's never right on the mark, the exact kind of speed, right?
Yeah. And
so it's slowing up, slowing down, going fast, slowing down. It's all of that kind of adjustment, So you and your partner we're doing an adjustment.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, we're going too fast.
We're doing our damn best.
Right.
That's for sure.
Right. I mean, sometimes I think like life's like, life's like getting a massage, like if you don't communicate to the person giving you the massage when things are too painful, there's no adjustment. When you don't communicate when they're not painful enough, there's no adjustment. There has to be this relationship to the change where it's all about adjustments. I mean, it's all about these tiny little adjustments about how much is too much, how much is too little, In psychotherapy, you're thinking about that all the time. What's the question that is so provocative it'll throw this person into pain? What's the question that's so boring where nothing will happen? And what's the middle question that'll get them to think, right? And that's the same sort of thing. How do you find those places? It's very hard, in life.
And made harder when our ego is attached to a certain outcome. I imagine as a therapist, if the therapist is attached to being the one and has their identity as the one who asks the questions that caused the patient to just break down in tears, and you can get attached to this. And then so you can become not really listening anymore. And this happens in relationships. This happens in all kinds of different situations where people have this idea about their identity and they don't want to be questioned. And especially if you have, this is like your thing, this is something that you take great pride in. I think of sexuality as a great example. Like a lot of people for no good reason, have this deep attachment to their identity of being perfect in bed. Right. So if they receive any kind of like, hey, a little softer, or, hey, what about doing this? What about like a little more foreplay? They're like, what do you mean? Like
Right.
I'm perfect.
Right.
I've watched so much porn. I know I'm killing it. Like, but that's going to prevent them from really like listening and be like, oh, okay, you're different. I'm different. I'll adapt. I'll learn. And so it's instead of, one of the things that I think is important, instead of identifying with the one who knows everything, identify as the one who's always learning, the master who's always learning, rather than the master who knows everything, which really, if you think you know everything, you don't know shit, because we're always just learning.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I struggle sometimes over this concept of ego, but I think, there is a kind of ego that is inflexible, and there's a kind of ego that is curious. And the kind of ego that's curious is what we want to head towards. There's still an I there, which is what ego means, right?
Right.
And it's strong, and it has fortitude to it. But what it is it's looking to understand the other. And I don't know if I want to be egoless, because that goes away.
It's not even possible.
No, right.
Your ego becomes the one who's egoless.
Right.
It's like it's just a game. It's your own little game you're playing.
I want to be in the state of curiosity, imagination, and especially curiosity. Imagination, because I need my imagination to understand what's happening to the other person. I have to be able to hold their brain and mind and understand it. And I want to be curious about them. And that gets blocked when it's like, I just need this, this, and this, or my feelings are going to get hurt if that happens, and all of that. That's an uncurious state,
Yeah, absolutely. Well, as we wrap this up here, are there any we haven't talked too much about the actual 10 reasons. Is there anything from your 10 reasons that you want to highlight? Any reason that particularly stands out or that might be surprising to people? The 10 reasons why we don't change?
They're kind of the least interesting part of the book to me, but I guess, this idea that, so much of our expectation, so much of our hope has to do with worry about other people hoping for us, letting them down. And we can get tied up into that so much that it holds us back, because we have this experience of wanting their aspirations, wanting their excitement about us. And that's such a fundamental risk. So that's one of the reasons. I find that to be a really powerful one, that we have to give up to move on, But I think that's the main one. That the main lesson I want people to learn from the book is that if you can recognize that it's really kind of a big mess, and not think that there's some one big answer, you're probably in a better place to change, and that every book out there that gives advice is great, but it's only good if you're in the place where you're ready to do the change. And to be ready to do the change is to be in that contemplative place where you're kind of looking at yourself and saying, do I really want to give this up?
Do you have a journaling style that you like to use when you're contemplating something, when you're trying to make a decision? Do you just list pros on one side of the sheet, cons on the other? Is there any other way that you kind of go through this in a journaling method?
I don't. I think that's a great idea. I don't, because I have this learning disability. I don't really write things down. I might draw something out, I might draw something out. But I think mostly I take a walk and contemplate these things and think about them, a little bit, What's the good in this? Often I stick with it, because it's like, I like a lot of the good in this behavior. I'm not going to diet right now because I'm kind of liking this, but that's that sort of thing.
Do you ever feel like you can hear the whisper of what the ancient Greeks would call the daemon, what might be your potential or your soul, this sense of knowing that kind of can cut through some of the intellectual contemplation? It's difficult, because I think it's that voice can also be co-opted by, different other aspects of the psyche. But have you experienced that feeling where it's just like, you don't really have a good reason, you just kind of know something?
Yeah. So that might be more tied to the gut brain than the brain.
Right.
And to physical experience. And every decision I make always ends up being based on that. Even when you know all the answers, the final decision is an act of faith. The faith is in our gut, And so it's that kind of act of, I'm going to have faith in this feeling right now, Does that answer your question?
It does.
Yeah.
It does. Yeah. Because it can be really kind of mysterious. But if you just think about it as, and you talk about all of these different somatic cues
Mm-hmm.
that, if we're not aware of them, they might be happening under the surface, but it just pushing us towards a decision. And we may think that we're making this decision just with our pure intellect.
Right.
But really there's probably a lot of other forces at play that are actually driving us towards something. And maybe that's translating it into our mind as this, still small voice inside, as Ram Dass would say, or,
Mm-hmm.
this kind of whisper that comes through. And maybe it is something a little bit more metaphysical than that as well. And maybe some combination of both. Maybe your gut and your soul are in communion, and who knows. But it is interesting where there's the way to intellectually do it. And sometimes that's necessary, but then there'll also just be this knowing where you're just like, all right,
Yeah.
I know what to do.
Yeah. Do I have a couple seconds? I'll tell you.
You do?
Okay. So this guy, Kurt Lewin, I mentioned before, he believed that we live in these fields, that there's all these things holding us back from change. There's all these things moving forward towards change. And we're the little place in between those two things. Wherever we are, that's where we are towards our change. And certain things can happen in our environment because we're not in control of this whole field. There's all kinds of things going on that push us forward. And so I was in New York, and I was getting on the elevator to give feedback to one of my supervisees. And I hate giving feedback. I hate giving feedback, and I'm no good at it. And I knew I had to do it, and I want to change this. I want to be able to do it well. But I was talking myself out of it. And I got on the elevator, and someone spilled coffee. And this person from the back of the elevator brought up some sugar, and they poured it on it to make it congeal. And this other person came and put a napkin on it. And then we all sort of sat there staring at that coffee, and kind of pleased that we took care of this person's spilled coffee. And a person gets off the elevator, and they yell back, "That was the best elevator ride ever." And everybody just starts cracking up. And then we get to the third floor, and this guy, this like sort of serious guy in a suit, gets off, and he says, "Same time next year, we all meet here for the elevator." I get off on the 8th floor, and I am completely ready to give feedback.
Yeah.
So something in me, because I was around kind humans, and because I had this experience of kind of connectedness, allowed that part of me to trust my gut, to trust that feeling, And so we never know what the thing is that's going to make it so that we end up kind of in a place of greater trust in ourselves. It's surprising. It's sort of shocking. And that's why one day you say, "I'm going to diet," and you can't. And the next day you wake up and all of a sudden you're dieting, right? There's things in our world that just sort of shift, and all of a sudden we're ready to do it.
That's a great story. And again, and you've brought it up so many times, the importance of connection, the importance of surrounding yourself. Those two people who made those comments and the ones that were helpful, like when they're part of your tribe and they're part of your clique, they're part of your chosen family, your ohana, you're going to be able to have that much more faith in yourself and in all of these situations, just based on this kind of community that you've developed. And that just highlights the importance of surrounding yourself with people that inspire that in you, not only by what they're telling you, but by how they act, which is how we really learn. It's like when we see somebody doing something, like that's what's going to cause us to want to be like that and do the same. It gives us permission to do it. Courage is contagious.
Yeah. And that points at the insanity of our behavioral health system, which takes all of those resources away from people to cure them. We're going to put you in a hospital. We're going to remove you from your friends. We're going to now call you something that makes you an outsider. Everything that makes us feel like we belong is ripped from these people in order to treat them. It's insane. That's an insane system.
Yep.
And I'm pretty sure that a lot of their behaviors are the result of that, not some psychiatric thing in their brain. You're removing them from the very medicine they need to kind of live their lives. Same with substance abuse.
Yeah. Well said. Well, this has been a real pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Really enjoyed this. Where's home for you, by the way?
I'm in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I grew up in California, but this is
That's where you're hanging out. Well, this was great. The book is How We Change and 10 Reasons Why We Don't. Audible, as well as Amazon and bookstores. If bookstores still are operating right now, I don't even know. But awesome, man. This was a real pleasure.
It was a really fun play date.
Yeah, indeed it was. Next time, bangles. Next time, Bengals.
I'll do it.
Cool. All right. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks for checking out this video. For more like it, please subscribe to my channel. And of course, the Aubrey Marcus Podcast with new episodes every single week. And follow me on Instagram @Aubrey Marcus. Thank you so much.